Samantha's eyelids fluttered open, an oppressive glare searing through her retinas. A harsh buzz assaulted her ears, a cacophony of fluorescent spite that seemed to claw at the edges of her consciousness. She bolted upright, her breath catching in her throat as the stark, unending yellow of the backrooms unfolded before her. The panic came in waves, a treacherous tide that threatened to pull her under with each pulse of the artificial light above. Her hands flew to her head, attempting to steady her spinning world, but the damp carpet beneath her offered no comfort. "Where am I?" The question was a whisper lost amidst the symphony of electric hums. Each buzz was a needle prick on her sanity, a reminder that this place was alien, unwelcoming. Samantha's heart hammered against her ribcage, demanding an escape from the blinding expanse. She staggered to her feet, the sterile air clinging to her skin like a layer of unease. Samantha's mind groped for memories or any signpost that could explain how she had ended up in this labyrinthine nightmare. But this place was a void, swallowing her fragmented thoughts and leaving her stranded in a sea of dread. The eerie stillness was complete, an absence of life that created a vacuum in her chest. No distant chatter, no city bustle, not even the comforting drone of traffic from an outside window. Here, the quiet was a living thing, an entity that breathed down her neck and coiled around her ankles, anchoring her to the spot. With each tentative step, Samantha traced the lines of the walls, her fingers seeking out seams or imperfections. But the walls were seamless, indifferent to her plight. The sameness of the corridors pressed in on her, a maze constructed by an unseen architect with a penchant for psychological torment. "Think, Sam, think," she urged herself, her voice a brittle sound that shattered against the oppressive walls. Had she been here minutes? Hours? The concept of time mocked her, its parameters dissolving into the monotony of yellowed wallpaper and endless hallways. A growing sense of dread unfurled within her, a realization that perhaps memory was a luxury in a place devoid of markers. Here in the backrooms, the past seemed like a distant dream, the future an impossibility. All that existed was the now, a now filled with the buzz of lights and the suffocating embrace of silence. The pallid fluorescence of the overhead lights cast an unforgiving glare on Samantha as she scurried along the corridor, her hands trailing across the cold, unyielding surface of each door she encountered. With a trembling hand, she twisted another doorknob, only to be met with the same unrelenting resistance that had greeted her every attempt before. The click of the stationary handle ricocheted off the walls, a taunting reminder of her entrapment. "Home," she whispered to herself, a mantra to keep her mind from fraying at the edges. Just think of home. A fleeting image of her downtown apartment flashed before her eyes. The cozy nest she'd built with her husband, nestled between the cacophony of city life and the sanctuary of their shared dreams. It was a stark contrast to this labyrinthine nightmare, where neither sun nor moon held dominion and shadows played tricks on the eyes. "Michael," she breathed out his name, picturing him in their modest kitchen, his laughter mingling with the sizzle of eggs in the morning. How ordinary her life had seemed then, how she had taken the predictability of each day for granted. Now, the very notion of mundane seemed like a paradise lost, a cruel joke snatched away by the backroom's hungry maw. "Damn it!" Samantha's voice cracked as she slammed her palm against the next door, the sting of impact jarring but welcome, a testament to her reality amidst the surreal. She pressed her forehead to the wood, feeling the grain imprint itself onto her skin, wishing for it to magically give way and reveal the path back to her life before. But there was no such reprieve. Door after door rebuffed her, identical sentinels guarding nothing but the endless stretch of corridor that looped back upon itself like a serpent swallowing its own tail. Frustration mounted within her, a hot, desperate emotion that clawed at her throat and threatened to overwhelm. "Think, Sam. There must be a way out." she muttered, trying to infuse her voice with the determination she so desperately needed. But in the hollow echo that returned to her, she heard only the growing despair, the realization that this place defied logic, defied hope. With a weary exhale, Samantha pushed off from the door and continued down the hallway, her steps mechanical. Each footfall was a reminder of the sameness, the continuity of her predicament, where even the flicker of the lights seemed to mock her with their steadfast rhythm. Got to keep moving, she coached herself, knowing that stillness was a luxury she could not afford, not when the Backrooms hungered for those who dared to let their guard down. Samantha's footsteps echoed in the silence, a metronome to her exhaustion. The ambient hum of the fluorescents above played a tedious symphony for an audience of one. Time had become an abstract concept, divorced from the rhythm of sunrises and sunsets that once dictated the pace of her days. She could have been wandering for hours, or perhaps even days. The relentless sameness of the corridors offered no clues, only questions. Think of something else, she whispered to herself. But every thought was a heavy chain, pulling her down into an abyss of existential dread. Her life had been so normal, so wonderfully mundane, with morning coffees and soft kisses goodbye from her husband as he left for work. Now, that reality seemed like a distant fairy tale, swallowed up by the oppressive walls that surrounded her. Suddenly, Samantha halted, finding herself at an intersection where multiple corridors branched off like the veins of a leaf. Her breath caught in her throat as she stood frozen, her heart pounding out a frantic beat. Left, right, straight ahead. The choices sprawled out before her, indistinguishable in their promise of further entrapment. A faint shuffling reached her ears, a soft, irregular scraping that set her nerves alight. It was close. Too close. Fear clenched her stomach, and she imagined all sorts of horrors lurking just around the corner. The rumoured night entity that was said to be more an experience than a being, a living location with malice pulsing through its very walls, watching her struggle with cold amusement. Please, not now, she begged in a breathless whisper, though there was no one to hear her plea. Her mind raced with memories of Dr. Lancaster's cryptic warnings about the Backrooms, his voice steady, yet always tinged with something unplaceable. Fear, perhaps, or anticipation. The shuffling grew louder, a discordant counterpoint to the buzzing lights. With panic clawing at her spine, Samantha made her choice. She turned sharply to the right, fleeing down the corridor as if the devil himself were on her heels. Her only lifeline was the hope that somewhere in this labyrinth, amidst the echoes of her own footfalls and the haunting silence, there lay an exit, a return to the world she knew, a world that now seemed like nothing more than a dream. Samantha's heart hammered against her ribs as she skidded around the corner, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. The intersecting corridors sprawled before her like a monstrous spiderweb, each path indistinguishable from the next. But it wasn't the maze itself that ignited the primal terror coursing through her veins. It was the shambling figure that emerged from the gloom. A pale and emaciated husk of a man rounded the corner behind her, its movements jerky and erratic, as if every step were a battle against an invisible force. Its skin stretched taut over protruding bones and hollow eyes that bore into Samantha with an unsettling hunger. Was this creature once human, or perhaps something birthed from the twisted physics of this place? Either way, its gaunt form and shuffling gait spoke of unspeakable suffering and relentless pursuit. Instinct took over. Samantha bolted. Her feet pounded the stained carpet, each stride launching her further from the grotesque apparition. She didn't dare glance back, for fear the sight would paralyze her with horror, or worse, beckon her into the embrace of madness that seemed to radiate from the being. The fluorescent lights above flickered and hummed, casting stuttering shadows that danced upon the walls. In those brief flashes, the creature appeared less like a man and more like a wraith, its outline wavering as if it were a figment of her frazzled imagination, a spectre born from the darkest corners of her mind. She reached an open door, the space beyond it mercifully free from the nightmarish sameness of the halls. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, Samantha hurled herself through the threshold, slamming the door shut with a force that echoed down the endless corridors. She felt it then, a brush of contorted fingers grazing her shoulder, a touch so cold it seared her flesh. Safe within the confines of the room, Samantha collapsed against the door, her body heaving with sobs and shallow breaths. Relief flooded her, dim and tremulous, as she sank to the floor. The dimness enveloped her like a shroud, offering a temporary respite from the relentless terror that stalked her every move. She had escaped, but only just. The knowledge gnawed at her, a reminder that in this eldritch dimension, safety was nothing but an illusion, a fleeting moment snatched from the jaws of the inexplicable horrors that roamed the backrooms. Samantha's breaths came in ragged gulps as she leaned against the cold, unwelcoming door that had granted her a temporary sanctuary. Her eyes, wide with residual fear, darted around the room's gloom. The single bulb overhead swung lazily on a frayed wire, casting erratic shadows that skittered across the walls like nervous insects. Beneath its sallow light, the walls themselves seemed to breathe, covered in a tapestry of unsettling scribblings, symbols and messages that twisted and coiled in patterns that defied understanding. A heavy silence settled over the room, thick enough to muffle the pounding of Samantha's heart. It was an eerie quiet, punctuated only by the distant, incessant hum of neglected fluorescent lights from the corridors beyond, a stark contrast to the cacophony of her recent flight. The stillness felt alive, as if the space itself was listening, waiting. Her gaze lingered on the markings surrounding him. They crawled into each other, forming a maze more confounding than the one she had fled. Scratched into the surface with what must have been frantic urgency, the glyphs hinted at knowledge both profound and forbidden. Perhaps they were the last will of those who came before her, or maybe warnings meant to guide or deter any who followed. As Samantha's breathing steadied, a sharp, sudden shriek tore through the air, shattering the quiet. The sound was not merely heard, but felt, a visceral vibration that resonated within the very marrow of her bones. Instinctively, her hands flew to her ears, pressing against them in a vain attempt to block out the piercing wail that echoed endlessly through the backrooms. The scream seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a symphony of terror that resonated through the labyrinthine network of rooms and halls. It ebbed and flowed, a tide of primal fear that lapped at the edges of her mind, threatening to erode her sanity. The reverberation lingered long after the initial cry had faded, leaving a sinister silence in its wake. Samantha's fingers trembled as she withdrew them from her ears, her eyes scanning the cryptic inscriptions once more. A shiver ran down her spine as she considered the possibility that these were not mere walls, but the flesh of some greater entity, the night itself, perhaps, its whispers hidden in plain sight, its screams a herald of the unfathomable dread lurking just beyond perception. No longer did the walls of the backrooms echo with the dissonant shriek that had so recently punctured the silence. Instead, a new sound wormed its way into Samantha's consciousness, a distant melodic lilt that was almost too faint to discern. Tilting her head, she strained to listen, her body stiffening as the unmistakable cadence of a child's voice singing a nursery rhyme unfurled through the stale air. "Ring around the rosy." The words were warped, stretched thin across the impossible architecture of this place, reverberating off invisible corners and hidden alcoves. Each note was imbued with an innocence that had no right to exist in the oppressive dread of this place. Yet there it was, a beacon amidst the omnipresent hum of the fluorescence, a lifeline cast into the abyss. Samantha felt the pull of curiosity tugging at her. weaving through the threads of her fear like silverfish skittering across old paper. It was madness, surely, to chase a phantom's lullaby, but the alternative was to remain cocooned in the deceptive safety of this room. A room cloaked in scribbles that held the tangled whispers of the night. Pocket full of posies. Her heart hammered a staccato rhythm against her ribs as she rose to her feet, the dusty floor sighing beneath her. Could it be a trick of the entity? A lure designed to draw her further into its clutches? Or perhaps a sign from Iris or Dr. Lancaster, whose knowledge of these cursed corridors dwarfed her own? No answers presented themselves, only the haunting melody that beckoned her forward. Ashes, ashes. Slowly, with each step feeling like a lifetime, Samantha pushed open the door she had so desperately slammed shut mere moments before. The corridor greeted her with its familiar sterile chill, the overhead lights buzzing like a swarm of electric locusts. Her skin prickled with gooseflesh, not solely from the cold, but from the anticipation of what lay ahead. We all fall down. Taking a shallow breath, Samantha steeled herself against the unknown dangers lurking in the shadowed recesses of the backrooms. With every fibre of her being screaming for caution, she set off in the direction of the singing child, leaving behind the illusory sanctuary. She walked with purpose, her determination fueled by a resolve to find answers, to find an exit, to reclaim the ordinary life that now seemed like a distant dream. She moved through the maze-like halls, guided by the spectral voice that never wavered, never faltered. The song was a thread through the labyrinth, and Samantha clung to it as if it were Ariadne's own. Whatever entities might skulk in the outer reaches, whatever malice the night might harbour, she would face it head-on. For somewhere beyond the next turn, past the endless stretch of sameness, lay the possibility of escape, and Samantha would grasp at any chance, however slim, to return to the world she knew.